You're here to study Bridgman. This is recording 2 on simplifying from our 12-session 2020 bootcamp, and updates are always at marshallart.com. Hey, it's 12 o'clock, at least in my neck of the woods. And we are at the Bridgman Figure Drawing Bootcamp, and this is our second official meeting. We are here. We are going to talk about straight lines today. We're going to talk about the proportions of the figure. We're going to talk about shapes. Let's get right into them. Proportions of the human figure. The first point I'd like to make is that there is no accurate canon of true proportions. You say, well, what about Richet's? Didn't you say that was an accurate one? Well, I'm making a point. There is no accurate canon of true proportions because proportion is subjective. What's that mean? It means that a person who makes a chart of proportions for artistic purposes is making choices. You say, couldn't you put everybody's proportions into a computer and average them out? Yes. And if you do that, think about it. You're choosing to use an average, and that average might miraculously not be the precise proportion of any one individual. Proportion is subjective. Case in point historically. These are one of Durer's sets of proportions. Look at those dates. We're talking about half a millennium ago. Over 500 years ago. Durer said this. Now, that may not be your set of ideal proportions, but who's to say? Who's to say what the ideal set is? What about this? These are Rimmer's sets of proportions. What do you think? Can you say that these proportions are wrong? You can say they're unusual. You can say they're statistically unlikely. But you can't say they're wrong. He is making a choice to do different types. Who's to say that these proportions so worked out by this devoted artist are wrong? Who's to say that this sincere artist's depiction of an ideal female is wrong? Who's to say that Well, actually, a lot of people say that these proportions are wrong, and this artist's sales of hundreds of millions of comics may be justification for his wrongness. But to recover from this image, let us go to the other extreme. Let us go to what I mentioned yesterday and showed you yesterday, which is Dr. Paul Richet. Who's to say that these proportions are right? They're certainly closer to a so-called average. They are meticulously thought through for that purpose. To say put it all in a blender and here's what we come out in 19th century France. But I would bet that not a single person in here, there's a lot of people in this webinar today. I would bet that not a single person in here matches these proportions exactly. Not if we get critical. So let's move from accuracy to something useful. This is what? 150 years ago or so? No, 130 years ago maybe? I don't know when the book was published. This is about 100 years ago. This is Bridgman. This will be useful today and tomorrow in our class. Notice that all I'm showing you here are skeletons. So how are skeletons? I mean, even just the three masses that he's going to make a big deal out of. How are they useful in inventing a figure or drawing from life? Well, I'm going to make one point first about skeletons, because when we talk about proportion, we talk about primarily skeletal landmark points. You see, a landmark is, for artists' figure drawing purposes, any place where the bone is subcutaneous, where it's under the surface. We've talked about this, right underneath those cheeks, this little bump on the little finger side of the wrist, this bump on the inside of the elbow. Hey, what are some others? Let's find them on here. Here's a big important one. This whole bone here, the sternum, which is divided into three parts. Manubrium and gladiolus and that little xiphoid or ensiform cartilage, though, which we usually leave that out because in most people it tucks back into there so that it's not visible. But that portion of bone, the sternum, that portion of bone, even if you develop huge pectoralis majors, and the muscle has to crawl over it to have more room to grip, that portion of bone is tappable under the surface. And because it is, and conveniently for us, it makes a vertical line on the surface that divides the left half and the right half. It's a wonderful landmark that when you're inventing a rib cage and you say, I'm going to look up at the rib cage and I'm going to put that line right there, that will be the sternum. And then you've got a perspective landmark to say that you're looking up at it. If I were to do a rib cage that I was looking down at, and I were to put the center line there, say that's the sternum, then I'd be able to build a rib cage out of that in perspective because I had a landmark point. What's another one? Well, these little portions of the collarbone, the clavicle. And by the way, you don't need to write all this down. I mean, if you're drawing, great. I mean, if you're just paying attention. I'm not teaching you anatomy right now. Well, it sure seems to me like you are. Pointing out the names of bones. I'm not teaching you these bones. If you forgot every bone that I teach you in the next 3 to 5 minutes, you'll do fine. Because we're going to go over those bones later. I'm making another point. I'm just giving you context. And that is that some parts of the bones are tappable under the surface. This part is, and so is this entire collarbone. You can see it on the person you love. You've probably written songs about it, sung to it. And then this little bump right here. What is that little bump? That little bump, which isn't a bump so much as a plateau, that is the outermost point of the shoulder blade. It's a complex thing. Because you see, this portion of this spine of the scapula faces toward us, and this portion faces up, so it actually rolls. But here is the big point. The big point is that the collarbone all the way out to there, and the spine of the scapula all the way out to there, and the place that they join right here are all tappable under the surface, which means that when you gain weight, they become a dimple. And when you lose weight, they become a projection. Now, what about this? That's a big important part of a bone. That's the head of the arm bone, the head of the humerus. What about that? Is that a landmark point? It is not, because it's buried underneath a great mound of muscle, primarily the deltoid. But you could say, yeah, it is a landmark point. How? How do you mean? Because once we know that this point here of the outermost point of the shoulder, once we locate that, we know that an eyeball or so below it will find that humerus. So we might care about that pivot point. Now let's back up. Let's back up. The most important one for today and tomorrow is the sternum, because it can be tapped all the way along there. Now on the back, you've got what? The seventh cervical, the first thoracic, and then when starting with the first thoracic, we've got 12 of these little bumps on the back of us that you do not see when you lean back like that, because the flesh will all scrunch up over it and cover it up and make it a groove. But you will have a center line on there. That can be useful for constructing a figure. And if you pull your shoulders around to the front and stretch the skin over that, you'll see a whole bunch of little bumps. And those will be aligned vertically so that you'll still have a center line there. And if you're drawing a character from the back, that center line that goes like that, that would turn into an arrowhead, that would be part of a pelvis like so, and then a head would be over here, and it would be looking away from us, and the shoulder blades would be here, and the arm could be out there. But can you tell right away that's a back and not a collarbone? And as soon as we get a latissimus dorsi in there, it reads as a back, even though it's very simple and very cartoony. It doesn't look like a front. We know that that is a back. Now, why do we know that? I want to show you something. Now I am teaching you anatomy. The front of this skeletal view, with that rib cage in there, which is an egg with the small part at the top, sorry for the lack of symmetry, is exactly the same shape in an ortho. I mean, if you x-ray a person front to back, it's exactly the same overall shape from the front as the back. Well, that makes sense. Fill them in with a felt tip marker and you wouldn't know that they were a different shape. But look at how much longer the back of the rib cage looks. Watch this, watch this. Compared to over here, the front is so short. How can these things be? Let me show you. From the side, the rib cage has an opening that's angled like that. And this point right here of the pit of the belly, the thoracic arch, aims back like that. So we have a much shorter front and a much longer back. Hey, maybe a little something went on in your brain. This is why we study multiple views. Let's go back to our main point. The front of a rib cage has a landmark point on it that is always evident on a nude figure. And even if this person's wearing a collared shirt or a tie, they will have that center line. And on the back, you will have a center line. Those are important. Anything else important on the rib cage? Yeah, one other thing. Watch this, watch this. This point right here and this point right here are important. Because if you feel comfortable enough to go into the bathroom and take off the top part of your garment and raise your arms up and suck in your belly, you will see little bumps right there. Because those are the corners of the rib cage. And there are other landmark points on here. There are other things on here, but we're not going to deal with them now. Where cartilage meets bone and where this angle of the ribs, there's an actual plane break that happens in there. Not important now because we are simply saying, why is the skeleton Why is it so important to study the skeleton for proportions? Because the skeleton determines where things are. Let's do one other set of things here. On this pelvis, on your pelvis, even at this moment, there is a front corner. Whoa, that is a complex bone. This is a complex set of bones that fuse together that are at the frontmost point, and then the widest most point, and then the highest most point, and then back in. And when we did that, look what we did. We went from the front point. Watch what's hard. Watch, you got to pay close attention here. When we went back on that line, we went this way and came to outward. That means this came toward us, but we can't tell in this view. And then it went in this much, but we only went like that to get to the high point. And then we went down, and here we didn't see how we were going down. A pelvis is a complex form. Well, prepare to be happy. You do not need to learn all of those things to draw good figures. You'll learn something about them. Here's what you care about. You care about that is a crucial point. You can tap it under your skin. You lose enough weight, it sticks out. You gain weight, it becomes a dimple. It's subcutaneous. In fact, a good portion of this crest, all the way till about there, is tappable under the skin. It sinks down a little bit deeper. All right, good. I need to know that. Why do I need to know that? Because when a person stands up at attention and is not leaning one way or another, you can say that this line and this line will be horizontal. And the same thing would happen if you could see that corner of the rib cage over there. Those are going to be horizontal. And this, excuse me, I didn't get it placed exactly right about there. That triangle, that little arrowhead on the back, those will be also lined up horizontal. And that will be important for what we study today and tomorrow. That is the big deal that Bridgman made about the squash and the stretch. As soon as you take that rib cage and put it at an angle like this, and let that pelvis go at an angle like this, those are abstract ideas to a person who does not know anything about the position of the landmarks. This crunches and this stretches, and that will make a big difference. There's another point, and we're going to get to it. It's a sensitive point, obviously. And that's that joining together. This half of the pelvis and this half of the pelvis join together in the center. The symphysis pubis, and here we see that it's, we're looking this way at it, and so that all kind of lines up. And this point and this point and this re-entry point make that arrowhead. And watch this, on the back, it's actually buried down in there a little bit because the skin, if we're looking down at this, that sticks out a little bit, and the arrowhead goes back there. Now, I'm done with this point. I'm gonna allow questions in a moment. Here's the point I made. We study the skeleton for proportion because bones are unyielding. They're made out of steel. They're made out of rock. They don't squash and stretch. And you've got 3 big sets of them that determine the position of everything else to some degree. So we care about studying the skeleton to get the proportions. But we need a whole body, don't we? This has all been just the rib cage and pelvis. So we're going to move to the whole body in a moment. Okay, let's go to Q&A. When drawing a figure, what do you usually start with? Well, Yusuf, people start different ways. Bridgman and Vilpu start with the head. Nicolaides says don't do that. Start with an energy line or a grounded line or something like that. Some people start with a mannequin. Some people start with a skeleton. Some people start with a crazy bunch of scribbles. So, Yusuf, it's too complicated a question for right now. Right now, we're trying to look at the value of proportion. Gary asks, do you think learning to copy accurately is a genuine stepping stone to drawing from imagination? I do not. But let's not misread my answer. Learning to copy accurately is a genuine skill. It's a valuable skill. There are some people who cannot copy accurately at all, but they can invent like crazy. I know this. And there are people who can copy absolutely accurately, and they never learn to invent. So I think that it may be a stepping stone. We're going to pretend like it's a stepping stone today, because it is a genuine skill. Peter Martin asks, will these slides be available, especially the Dr. Faust slide? The Dr. Faust slide is available through Dover. The whole book is available through Dover. It's real cheap, and it's on a CD-ROM, too. Caleb, how extreme are skeletal anatomical variations between individuals of the same gender? Caleb, a question that I anticipated, or I wanted someone to anticipate. This is a question, and someone else asked it, too. Let's put it this way. If you take one male of any ethnicity and another male of another ethnicity and another lifestyle, how different percentage-wise could their bodies become if you include the flesh? We're talking about the heaviest person and the skinniest person you could find. No, let's not be the heaviest and skinniest. Let's just say reasonable extreme. I'd say 300% difference, maybe more, when you keep the flesh on there. What about with skeletons? Certainly not 300%. Be more like 20, 30% at the extremes for the proportions of the skeleton. Which means we study the skeleton as an average because it is going to be more predictably within those parameters of measurement. And when I'm estimating, the extremes are 20 to 30%, but the typical is 10 to 20%. I'm estimating. I'm not giving you a researched answer, but that was a very good question because it leads to why I've taken this much time to talk about the value of skeletons and their landmark points, is that we care about them first. Lucas asked, do you think it matters to learn the bones in one specific order as to not get confused? However you learn it, Lucas. But starting with the way we're doing it here is a good way to do it. This is a first choice of how to do it. You start with the torso and you go out. Okay, I think we're going to stop the questions now. By the way, I should mention this. This is important for those of you who buy the wonderful book by Robert Beverly Hale called Masterclass in Figure Drawing. It's a great book, but it's got at least a dozen, maybe 20 errors in it. And some of the worst and most confusing errors are on the red overlay of this chart in that book that will drive you crazy. So I just tell you that if you go to Robert Beverly Hale's book where he took this, he didn't do it. I think it was put together after he died. There was mistakes in it. But we want a chart, and the best chart that I know, the most useful chart that I know, is no secret because probably half of you in this workshop are here because you already know about this course. Stan put so much into this. There's two systems here. One is the most famous system of all. It's head lengths. Head lengths goes like this. From the front, we've got one head length. If we go down from there, we land at about where the nipples will be. If we go down from there, we land at about where the navel will be. If we go from there, we'll land about where the groin will be, which is an important landmark because it's the joining together of the pelvis. It's sort of, in a way, proportionally, the center of the figure. And then we go a little strange. We'll go one head length down and then another half a head length down, and we'll land at about where the knee is. And then we go another 1.5 head length down, and we don't land on any landmark point, and then we go down to the ground. That is the most taught, most known. It's useful when a person's standing in front of you. The blue system is the one that Bridgman's student Robert Beverly Hale taught. I think it's a better system. We will get to it a little bit later. It takes more time, but it's certainly more accurate, and it's more useful. It's more useful when you're inventing a figure. Now, let's go as simply as we can. This is the simplest we can go. Bridgman sort of starts his book with proportion, almost anyway. Second thing he did. I'm glad that he put proportion in there early, because anyone teaching anything about drawing knows that proportion has to come in early. It may not be the first thing, but it's one of the first things. But in this book, he only gives us 3 pages on proportion drawing, kind of skimpy. And they're all adults, mostly male, half a female. But there is a lesson in that one-halfness. Did you know that if you learn 1/2 of a skeleton, that's all you got to know? Just learn this half. Other half is pretty likely to be the same. Now, what do we learn from this? This is a valuable lesson. If we say, I'm going to do a standing figure, and that's the top, and this is going to be where the feet are, all I've got to do is say that that's halfway down. Really, that's all you got to do? Yeah, and now I can hardly go wrong for the fact that a pelvis will fit into there and a rib cage will fit into there. Yeah, but how exactly does it fit into there? Not exactly like that, perhaps, but I'm not too far off. At least I had a general map, and then this leg will come down to there, and halfway down will be the knee, and then that will come down to there, and that will be the foot. And if it's a standing figure, well, my goodness, that did pretty well. Maybe a little longer knee might be wise. And that other arm back there, we can find some other proportional systems. This is a person happily marching, and the proportions were quite easy. Why? Because I had a halfway point. You're driving across your continent? How do you measure the full trip? What's the simplest division? We're halfway there, we're not halfway there, we're more than halfway there. That's a great way to measure. Put a mark anywhere, any size you want to. It can be 1 inch high or it can be 8 inches high. And just find a halfway point. And then look over here and you'll notice he gives us some other divisions. If you divide the top into thirds, watch this, dividing it into thirds. I wouldn't bother to divide this. Look, that doesn't land on a landmark point, but divide the lower part in half and look what you can do. You can say the head's got to fit in there. And that's going to be the pit of the neck, and the base of the rib cage will be somewhere around there. And the pelvis will overlap this, but the pelvis's groin will be right there. And then we're going to put let's make this angle this way and angle the other way. And then that knee, that's going to happen right about there. And that foot, that's going to happen right about there. And that other knee and that other foot will be there. Hey, the whole body in proportion. So what about the arms? Well, if the arms hang, the hand lands about mid-thigh. That's good enough. Are there specific proportions? There are. We'll deal with them later. What do you think, folks? This seems like the easiest proportional system for a standing figure that I know. I'm going to pause for another minute. See if there's any Q&A. Any Q&A? So would you say pubic bone or the tailbone is the vertical halfway? Pubic bone is the vertical halfway in this system that I'm teaching you. And it's a great way because it's so common, even if it's not exact. How do you approach proportions on oh, good question, Dieter. We're getting to that. Using cranial. Sam briefly showed a box on a foreshortened tilt delay. Yeah, we're going to get to that in a few minutes. That's what this course is very much about. What about using this in a difficult perspective? That's what this course is very much about. Now, Jacob, of course, that's a point that I'm hoping to make with some dramatic emphasis. But would we start with foreshortened views? Would you learn to draw a horse? Let me teach you how to draw a horse, by the way. Here's how you draw a horse. This is the same kind of thing that we've got going on with the, got that wrist too high. Now let's make sure we get that knee in there, and let's get that lower, and let's get that hock correct, and let's get that back hoof correct. Let's get those ears correct. And oh, we definitely want to get the other leg correct. How are you going to learn how to draw a horse from that? The way you learn to draw a horse is from an easier view with less foreshortening, where you'll look at it from the side like so, and you'll break it into the forequarters and midsection and hindquarters, and you'll find where that knee and that lower leg and that hock and that hoof is, and there you've got something that looks more like a horse. And then for the shoulder, you'll want to go something like that, and then that pillar that goes to that wrist and that kind of thing. Now, that could be a horse because it's understandable enough in its side view to get away with it. We don't start learning to draw with foreshortened positions. We move there after we've done the non-foreshortened positions. This system is the one that Robert Beverly Hale, Bridgman's student, taught. Bridgman, as far as I know, didn't teach it. You do not use the head length. Why? Look at my head. It's a pretty long head. Soon as I go like that, it's going to change. You can't see it in all positions. However, the head width is a ball. And watch this. That ball is visible from any position. Above, below, front, side, anywhere. The ball of the skull in any position can be figured out. It's a five-eyed ball. 5 eyes across, 5 eyes high, 5 eyes deep. You say, how do I know when it's got an extra eye in here? You learn to see it. You look for a ball. A ball can't be foreshortened. A ball will always be a ball if it's a ball. Watch this, folks. If that is a head width, that's the ball. That's this ball here. If you double it, you get the pit of the neck. If you double it again, you get the pit of the abdomen, pit of the neck. Those are both landmark points. They don't vary. Unlike nipples and navels. Then we look at the width of the scapula at its widest point, and it's that wide. And we look at the height of the scapula at that point, and it's that high. And we look at the length of the upper arm bone, and that's the most consistent to head width measurement I've ever seen. And the width of the head, actually hands vary much more. So that doesn't quite count. This is useful. The entire femur is about 3 head widths. Got a little off there. Watch this, here's another one. The distance when these are at rest, when the shoulder blades are at rest, the distance between them is about 1 head width. And you can always find a head width in your photograph or your model, if it's not, unless it's a wide angle lens. You can always use your strength. Remember, you might be working the size of, you can't say the head should be 6 inches wide. Can't say that. What if you're working on a mural and somebody's head is 40 inches big? 100 centimeters, whatever it would be. It's too big to say that it's any number of inches or centimeters. You say that I will use this unit, whether I'm working small or large, the unit of the head width, and I will look around through the body. Watch this. The widest rib cage will be 2 head widths. A pelvis on a man will be about 2 head widths, on a woman a little more than 2 head widths. It's a useful system. Stan lets you download this chart. He's got it in his video too. These are charts to study. There is a difference between a male and a female skeleton. I'm going to deal with it for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we are going to move on to an assignment. No, it's not an assignment. It's a project. Let's take a look at the difference between him and her. There they are in flesh. Everybody knows the difference. From the time we're babies, we're intimately familiar with the difference between the mommy and me. But what artists care about is that the relationship of the width of the pelvis to the rib cage is, on a woman, always a wider pelvis. On a man, typically, these things vary. Typically, the rib cage will be about the same width. There's the wide point and the frontmost point. That's the biggest difference. In fact, let's take a look at, there is a strange anatomy book from the 19th century by Eugene Wolfe. Dover has republished it. How often do you see an anatomy book frontispiece that looks like that? These are skeletons celebrating death. And he gives us a picture of the proportions of how we change from the time we're kids. Here's the way we change. When we're little, we've got great big foreheads and great big eyes. And we've got little frumpy bodies and little chimpanzee legs. And the main thing that happens is that when we're little, we're about 4 heads high. And look where the center of the body is. This whole lower part compresses. As we grow older, we eventually reach that point where the groin is halfway up. And then by the time we've come to, in our 20s, typically about 7.5 heads high. Now, as somebody pointed out, Loomis has plenty on this. Peck has quite a bit on it. Eugene Wolfe did this. Let's look at that. It's definitely wider than her ribcage. Look at the shape of that ribcage, by the way. That's quite often the case, that it's an egg with that narrow a top. Let's look at his. The widest point pretty much matches up with it. Same back here. Oh, you really notice it back here. That is a wider pelvis than that rib cage. This pelvis, a little bit wider in his case. Real close, though. Now, everything in there is, if you took a Photoshop of a pelvis and just narrowed its width to make the guy, that triangle on the back of those landmark points that we'll study later, that will be narrower on a man and wider on a woman. There's one other thing. Her rib cage tilts back more than his. Why? Her pelvis is on an axis more like that than his. So this is a counterbalance to it. Whenever anything goes one way, another thing will go the other way to balance it out. Yeah. Hey, you know who the best chart is? The best stuff? I know that I'm not getting a royalty for this. Stan's anatomy course, where it might even be the figure drawing course, where he shows the difference between the male and female skeleton and all of that stuff. That is just the best that I know of for covering everything you need to know. But you have a project. Your project is to do something like what the valve artists did, which is to make up your own ideal proportions. Project. Design your own proportion chart with exaggerations for fun. Quantify them. Measure landmark points. Right and left brain work. I'm going to let you write that down while I look at Q&A. Is this always necessary to make marks when figure drawing? I find it exhausting. John, it is not always necessary. John, I didn't give any indication that it's ever necessary. It's necessary when you need it. We've got to get past this. Anything that teacher says becomes dogma. These are useful. They solve problems. But it's necessary to learn some of this so that you'll know when you need it and don't. Should you learn both proportion charts, cranial and head, if you're already intuitive with them? No. You learn which ones help you. I think to memorize these proportions is useful. But is it necessary? Why do you ask? Because I don't want to do it. Oh. Then yeah, you should do it. But is it necessary? Why do you ask? Because I draw figures out of my imagination and they come out with just proportions that everybody likes. Then no, it's not necessary. Now, I want to tell you something about this. I wouldn't do it this way. What do you think Marshall would tell you? Those of you who had me as a teacher before, why would you not do a project like this tonight? What are you wasting energy on? I'm looking at the chat. The individual bones. Very good, Alex. 2 rendered, 2 finished. Very good, Etienne. This is if you want, let me put it this way. I'm going to try to make this so that it will cover all of your questions. If you have looked at what we've done and said, I don't like Durer's proportional charts. Richet's are a little sterile to me. Rimmer's are too bizarre. This is your opportunity. If you see this project as an assignment from the teacher, let me remind you, you get no college credit for this. There is no grade. And this is why, with online classes, some of the best students come out of these because they do not look at it as something that is serving the teacher. This is not serving me. They look at it and say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is what I'd do if there were no grown-ups telling me to do. I would make my male, female, in between, kid, grown-up, old person, alien, heavy weapons guy, and I would take time to design it so that it's my character, and then you bring energy to it, not of doing an assignment, but of doing a project. That's why I'm saying design your own proportion chart with exaggerations for fun. work of choice. Or I'm going to look at all of these different charts and just see if I can find some average that I like. Quantifying means actually using measurements. Right and left brain work means that at some point you say, I like it. It feels right. It's intuitive to me. Okay, I hope that answers questions. Now, too much detail there. That wastes time on rendering. Look at all the individual ribs. Are you going to draw a skeleton that has all the individual ribs for all of your figure drawings, or are you looking to do fleshed figures? You'll notice that Godfrey Bomas and Bridgman leave out the ribs. How can you leave out the ribs? I need the ribs. Those, you couldn't breathe with those rib cages. They don't flex. They're made out of rock. Yeah, that's Bridgman doing this project. Notice that Bridgman's rib cages are beach balls. Human beings are not shaped that way. You won't find people that have rib cages that are shaped like beach balls. They're always shaped like an egg with the small part of the top. Not in Bridgman's world. You make your choices. Robert Beverly Hales, in Drawing Lessons from the Great Masters, the great drawing book, I think the best drawing book of them all, points out that this is the choice of a form is a fundamental creative act. It is the basis of drafting creativity, to choose your proportions. Now, let's get to a question that was a very valuable question or observation earlier. All of this has been from the front, side, and back of a person standing straight up and down. How does a proportion chart help when you foreshorten? How does that proportion chart help with this? What good does this do to know that if we saw these guys from other views that they'd fit a proportion chart? Little good, kindreds. But before we trash knowing proportion charts, we won't trash it. I'm trying to put this in context. We can study all our lives from top to bottom and not know the other views. They're part of orthos as well. The side view, the back view, the top view, the under view. But here's something interesting. This is a Bridgman figure drawing boot camp, not a Rimmer. Bridgman did not do that many extreme foreshortened views. That's a lesson. Bridgman did mostly silhouette readable views. That's a favor to the viewer. That makes it read. I'm going to pause for a moment on that. That's something to think about. Somewhere in Bridgman's brain is something that Rimmer didn't have. Oh, those are hard to read. They're interesting. They're exciting. But doggone it, they look like squashed worms in silhouette. These do not. They read. That's an aesthetic choice. That's a creative choice. I think it's a habit that good artists get into. They think about their viewer. They ask whether this is confusing. Not always. Bridgman did do some foreshortened views. But you remember that yesterday, this is the one that I focused in on? That is confusing? He could have gone in there and really clarified that hand coming toward us and that finger coming toward us. He could have taken this and put it onto there, and this and put it onto there, and put more cross contour lines in there, and then wedged this into that upper arm so that we would see that these parts fit together, maybe like this. But he didn't. Maybe he was in a hurry, maybe he didn't care, maybe he just liked that he was jamming that way. Well, gosh, the head is certainly foreshortened, forearm is foreshortened, but most of this isn't foreshortened. The problem is I can't use that head length system on this. So what do we do? Well, between now and tomorrow, choose some of your favorite Bridgmans that you did even in the last 20-some hours. You chose favorite Bridgmans. And try understanding them, not so much as anatomy and form, but as graphic design. This is an illusion of 3D. And to get that illusion, next session we will begin working on understanding this as 3D forms. But to begin, let's approach this more simply. Let's see this as graphic design, as a silhouette, a shape that reads. Seeing a 3D form as a flattened shape makes it easier to see it in the simplest terms. Now we see shape. It was there all along. Now we can see it. Easier to measure and copy if that's what we want to do. One thing we notice reducing to shapes is the negative shape. See that bird in there? We use that awareness in design. It's part of composing. Here's another thing like that. If we reduce it not to flat forms, but to abstractions, like a blur, we can see two-dimensional patterns we may not have noticed. The way patches of tone here hold together like an archipelago, that they alternate in rhythm, that some patches, like this one, turn into pure contour lines, like there. Seeing this drawing, not as a figure, but for its literal shapes on the page, its angles, its graphic components. Let's deal with angles. Here's one way to see angles. Start with the simplest possible angles, verticals and horizontals. Let's start with a vertical. One vertical, perhaps from the highest point anywhere on the figure to the lowest. Find the halfway. Find two more halfways. Now, we can't go too wrong with our proportion height now. We could look for triangles next. Here's a convenient big one. It lands on some points that allow us to separate areas, gives us some milestones. And it almost makes me wonder if he was aware of that hidden symmetry. I doubt it. My guess is that he did his years of graphic layout exercises to have a kind of feel for balance that leads to this kind of after observation. Now, This is a large scaffolding. You could start small. You could use one section. You can say most of that leg fits into there. Another, most of that upper torso fits into those angles pretty nicely, simplifying it into shapes that are manageable, etc. And that is quantifying, but that can get clunky, and one can lose track of what one was going for with the big shapes in the first place. Long lines are best. Each of those lines has an angle. It can be numbered on the protractor. More than you need to do for figure drawing unless you're really committed to copying accurately. Nothing you'd ever want to do for inventing figures. This is a way to see flat surface layout. Simpler measurements than the complex figure that's up there. Something to compare all the wild angles to. That helps you copy. And the simplest you can go is a right angle grid. Here is the most basic, height and width only. Imposed over a difficult to measure drawing. Imposed over your reference, perhaps lightly in pencil. Matched on your page. See the whole thing in a right-angled envelope, even if roughly. Then find some midlines. And perhaps another set. Now, here is one way to check your major envelope, your major proportion. Make a square on one long side of the rectangle. Call it 1 across. This vertical envelope is 1 by 1.5. A rectangle of 1 to 1.5. There are other ways to quantify it. It's about 2 by 3. 2 across, horizontally, 3 vertically. Conveniently, it happened to fit those proportions. It may be fractions of that. I'll show you one more way to understand the proportion of a rectangle. From corner to corner, make a diagonal. That angle tells you a lot. It reveals a rectangle's proportion. If you begin with it, it dictates that proportion. Let me show you what I mean. That if I start with a line like that and then run a vertical down and a vertical down and a horizontal across and a horizontal across, no matter where this goes, no matter how high you bring it up, if you stick with those right angle divisions, this will always be the same proportion rectangle. You do a little short one down there. They will always be the same aspect ratio. Now, I know that we've gone beyond the purpose of this course. One more thing, though. Sometimes the envelopes we have in the house aren't big enough, and we decide, okay, I can get most of it in there. Some parts must dangle. That's okay. If you find a place to put a rectangle over something where it fits in a little better and other parts have to stick out, that's okay. You do that with the cube that you use for the head. You could include the nose but you don't. If that's a side view of a head, then you put another eyeball out here. You'll find a ball that goes in there. There'll be an egg on the front of it, and you get the most perfectly proportioned skulls. And they don't include the nose because the nose can be significant. Or less than significant. Any of these are worth experimenting with. These are experiments to see angles, to sensitize to graphic design. Now let's go back to the drawing. Good drawing, and complicated. Simpler straight-on views may be best to start with if you are beginning. Learn how to measure proportion of a human figure with some straight-on views and a straight line and a halfway point. And then we can divide this up however we want. But we'll say head like that, rib cage like that, pelvis like that, legs like so. But then where do we go? Well, when we think anatomically, we're going to put shoulders on there. We'll put arms on there. They'll have a hand, and so on. But look at what he's done here. He has already been thinking, as we are thinking with this, of graphic design so that in silhouette that would read very clearly as a woman's torso. But the angle that he has, that if you run that line down, it might meet the other long line right about here. Back here, he's accentuating the wideness of her back. And that angle is aiming about there. These are things to notice. Let's see, if we run these up here, they're landing right there at about that 7th cervical vertebrae and making 2 triangles that can be discerned by observing. How does this one go? If that goes like that, it's right about the same point. The pit of the neck is a little lower than the 7th cervical vertebrae, but close enough. That is one way of analyzing, and front views and back views are easy to do that with because of their symmetry. Now, rather than take more time on this, if you want to see more on how angles can help you copy, Proko has a video on it, and so does a former student of mine who did a very clear, simple one. You can look it up on YouTube or type in that cryptic URL, which is almost as much work as citing itself. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes here to boil down the lessons. When it comes to copying proportionally, to try to get things accurate, to see the way it lays out on the paper, here's a list of secrets. Verticals and horizontals, because they're easy to discern and we use them to compare other angles. And you can consider working on grid paper, because with grid paper, it's built in everywhere. Here's another. Halfway and third divisions, because they're easy to discern and they keep us from going way off. Here's another. Triangles and degrees of angles, because verticals and horizontals aren't necessarily shapes. Triangles are shapes, and they can be discerned. And degree numbers remind us that they really are at a particular angle. Can we look at an angle and name it? If we can, we're seeing accurately. and simplest possible shapes because this is complex. The biggest secret of interpreting proportions accurately is to reduce to simplicity. These were attempts. Sometimes he practically does the work for us. Look at how you can find triangles in there. Let's see, how would we triangulate that? Just maybe take it all the way up to there. If we can get the axis of that triangle and know that it's not shaped like this, and it's not shaped like this, it's proportioned a little narrower. That is starting with a something. That's not too bad right there. To call that a triangle. Bridgman is thinking this way, and other ways too. Here is your homework, by the way. If you want an assignment as opposed to a project, this is more of an assignment than a project. Draw shape analyses of favorite Bridgman images. That's a shape. That's a shape. That's a shape. That's a shape. It's also a form, yeah, but that's not what we're doing tonight. That's a shape. Hey, you could do it this way. Watch over here. That's a more complex shape, but it is a shape. This shape is quantifiable. It looks like a one-piece bathing suit. Straight lines are either in the position they need to be to make that shape, or they are not. So when you put a curved line like this, how can you copy that line exactly? It's really hard to do. But if you turn it into that, and that, every one of those straight lines has a specific degree. How basic can you boil down the shapes? Turn it into a few graphic chunks. See the whole upper torso like this. How simply can you group together the shape of the upper legs as a unit? Okay, lower legs and feet, both feet. This is not about form. This is not about rendering or technique. This is a reduction into a few comprehensible parts. This is to try to see graphically, much as you can, use straight lines. They exaggerate graphicness. Back to the drawing. And then where do we go with this? We go to where we'll go like this. And now I can just find this, almost feel it, as if I were in that position. Looks very stumpy there, but that's okay. This person's got their head crunched down. They've got their shoulder up there bigger. That arm actually comes out further this way. Somebody asked, should you start, when you draw, should you start with those points and those lines? The people I know that do the most exciting drawings never start with those points and those lines. You use those points and those lines to study. And then when you draw, if you start gesturally, you can adjust, as I am adjusting, to bring this guy's foot further out so that it is not now concerned with an accurate copy. It's concerned with whether he feels like, see, this is in a position like this. I had this way up here, but now I feel like if that leg is pressing out like that, then that this one might be aiming back down to come down to here, and that's more empathy with this figure than it is measuring it. Now, we'll take this up more in pose and balance when we're talking about gesture. I'm going to put this back up so that you can see the whole thing. I'm going to look at the Q&A. Let's see what we've got. What would be the end goal of the shape analysis? Training the brain to simplify? Exactly. The end goal of shape analysis is training the brain to see in simple shapes. It heightens sensitivity. It means that when we do a drawing, we become aware of the simple shapes. There are many ways to study drawing from Bridgman. A few years ago, I was practicing pen and ink technique, trying to learn to put lines down in single sweeps. The only preliminary drawing was done right there with the ink. Sometimes the pen would behave well, and I could do a little form study. Sometimes the pen would misbehave, and I'd have to pull the blop along in the hope of making something exciting, a style I wanted to play with. What was my motive here? One objective only: to get comfortable with ink, not to learn anatomy and form, to take a leaky pen, throw a line down and let it do something maddening and see if I could, instead of freaking out, use it. Attitude training. A whole different thing from straight line analysis. This was an impulse drawing, no reference, done in less than a minute to see how it would go. Problems, of course. That leg is longer than this one. That arm is longer than a human arm would be. This was an exercise, practicing throwing raw pin lines down to get beyond my fear of them. A whole different thing from your project tonight, though you will work on this when we study rhythm next week. Here we are doing a different exercise. straight line analyses, seeking the shapes of components. That is the best exercise I can offer you to get ready for what we will do next. That's for you if you're beginning. If you're advanced, approach this however you like. Now, I did this one last week, and this is an actual Bridgman. And this I did with a roller ball. And I want to tell you something about it. This piece that Bridgman did might be as big as a human head. This was done with a roller ball, and a business card will cover it in my sketchbook. But I was not working on technique here. I was working on the thing that you might want to work on, which is to look at how he dares to throw that center line on the back that far back. Look at how he dares to place this pelvis with the arrowhead facing that way. That's a landmark point. I don't ever dare to do that. In fact, even in this attempt to dare to do that, I still made it a little, I might want to say I want to do it more than that. Look at how he gets squash and stretch on that neck. Look at how he stretched that into a concave line because it's going to squash over here. And look at how I didn't. But if I did this over again, I'd say from here to there is pulling and stretch it like saran wrap. You do different drawings for different purposes. But one thing I did do is what we're segueing into now. I did try to see the rib cage, even though he didn't draw that rib cage on here. I tried to see the rib cage the way he saw the rib cage so that I'd get that crunch over there and get this point there where it stretches. Different drawings for different purposes. And here's where we go to three shapes. Bridgman, in his ideal figure, chooses to make the rib cage a beach ball. It's not a perfect beach ball. It's a beach ball that's not full of air completely, and it's a hot summer day, and it's starting to wobble a little bit. And he pulls out that thoracic arch. Now you say, hey, Marshall, I bet you're going to teach us that thoracic arch is three-dimensional like that, right? And it's got a center line on there like that. And that you can wrap rubber bands around it and make it 3D. And that we could do the same thing and look down on it. Now we're going to look down on that beach ball. And there's the opening of that rib cage like that. And then that center line that went down there like that is going to go like so. And then that thoracic arch, which is going to be in there like that. We're going to learn how to make it 3D. We sure are. So should we do that tonight? You sure shouldn't. Because tonight we have a job. And that is to see simple shapes. Three of them. What are they? You've got that in your Bridgman book. How are they useful? If you make a rib cage that's sort of shaped like a rib cage, we'll say that we've got that sternum on there, and you put it in a box. What do you do with the other parts? Well, what do we know about a pelvis? A pelvis on a man is as wide as a rib cage. On a woman, a little wider. How high is a pelvis? It's less high than a rib cage. How high exactly, though? What would you say? Can you divide it into thirds? Yeah, I'd say it's about 2/3. So if I'm going to make it this wide, female pelvis, then how high would I make it? About 2/3 of that. There we go. How high is the head? About the same height as the pelvis. How wide is it? Oh, it looks to me like it's about half the width of the rib cage. My goodness, I'm learning. So that means if I could take this width and make the head, the box that the head fits in, same height as the pelvis, that's going to do fine. Say, how about the space in between them? How about the space in between them? Hey, here's the thing about the space in between them. It changes. Go like this. It changed quite a bit. Go like that. It changed quite a bit. There's the last part of your assignment. Memorize the 3 relative masses. Measure and feel. Go through your favorite Bridgmans. Try to see through those figures. The head exists. It makes a shape. That may not be the true shape of a real head, but you're studying Bridgman, and he reduced it to shapes like that. How about the thorax? Well, those are how he's treating it. The pelvis, hard to see before you know anatomy, but try. The puzzlement preps you to understand better later, and if you know some form, your shape analyses may reveal that. There's a corner on these blocks, for example. If you're looking down on her thorax, a rubber band would go like that, top of the rib cage would be there. If you're looking at this character up, you'd see that he's got cross contours that go like that and doubled bellied. But no need to do that, especially if you're new to it and it confuses you. Don't be afraid of overlap. It happens and it can be good. Remember, you can draw through Bridgman's books for all sorts of reasons. This is a good first one. To seek shapes. Look for these parts. Next, we'll do forms. But shapes are simpler, and you are learning to see them. And these 3 parts are the big essentials. They are important because they are anatomical. They are the big parts. They're as simple as we can reduce the core of a figure. Those are the big 3 as shapes, with awareness of form. There is awareness of a plane break there and a plane break that would go there. But John has reduced them entirely to shapes and not afraid of overlap. Those are the big 3 with limbs and an appropriate simplicity of shape without any concern for form. Your turn. Memorize those 3 masses. Know them as components. Feel them if you can. More about empathy soon. Right now, be aware that they are in every body. Look how George saw them as shapes. And if you can, see them as shapes of your choice. This can be fun. It's a shape hunt through Bridgman. Go and do likewise. That was session 2 on simplifying from our 12-session 2020 summer bootcamp. If you want more videos, live sessions, and updates on other offerings, subscribe to my announcement list at marshallart.com.